Going on, everybody? It's your boy James 59. I ended my last video with some skepticism that 3 out of the 5 new civilizations in the upcoming Three Kingdoms DLC, the Shu, the Wei, and the Wu, would actually wind up on the ranked ladder when the DLE releases in early May. Now, while I was doing that video, it seemed that a lot of folks in the Age of Empires 2 community were having a bit of an airing of the grievances, or rather volcanic, vociferous airing of grievances, you might say. And so while I thought I was giving these 3 new civs a hard time, compared to other folks, I think I was going pretty easy on them. And that kind of inspired me to do this video here, because it's my view, at least, that for all the agony and agitation that we have around the Shu, the Wei, and the Wu, I do think that they eventually, and the keyword is eventually, belong in the game and on the ranked ladder. I just think the civs need some modifications. And I also think that perhaps the messaging around their story and around their inclusion probably deserves to be highlighted a bit more and maybe even explained just a bit more. So that's what I want to touch on here. And with that being said, let's go ahead and get into the video. Again, I'll try and present some of the most commonly heard cases against Three Kingdoms civilizations. And I might even agree with some of the conclusions, but for different reasons. So let's go ahead and talk about some of them. The first grievance I have seen the most is that the 3K, I might say Three Kingdoms or 3K civilizations, but the 3K civs are outside the historical timeline. Now, this is a conclusion that I do semi-agree with, but the reason I only semi-agree with it is the fact that I think Age of Empires 2 is already pretty loose with how it deals with the border between antiquity and the medieval era. We have civs like the Huns, the Romans, and the Goths that are kind of leaving the stage as the medieval era gets kicked off. But I actually think this reason about the historical timeline is a bit of a red herring, because the developers have anticipated it, and they have an interesting justification for why they think the 3K civs belong. And that's the fact that these civs are so advanced, even in this sort of, getting to be late stage of antiquity, that they could compete within the medieval timeline militarily. This is something that not only seems intuitive to me, but also helps to make sense of why the Huns, the Goths, and the Romans are even in the game. These are civs that could compete with other civilizations in the medieval era. Now, I think this is a great guideline for thinking about what civilizations ought to be included. We could ask this question: could they have hacked it against most of the civs in the game, given the status of medieval technology? Now, the truth is that the medieval era is pretty vast, and even civs that are at the height of their power in the early Middle Ages would probably lose to civs in the late Middle Ages just because technology has changed. So again, it's really hard for me, given the case that that's probably true for existing civs in the game. It's hard for me to get that up in arms about the 3K civs, given the developer's argument. Now, I think that there's also another criticism that we can make with the 3K civs on this point about the historical timeline, and I think it's a better one for me. And that's the fact that I don't think that these Three Kingdom civs have that much contact with any of the civs that are currently in the game. I mean, and that's something about that linkage between civilizations kind of just makes them feel alienated, and as a result, their inclusion jarring in the game. I mean, you take a civilization like the Sicilians. Now, there was definitely some criticism that the Kingdom of Sicily was too small when you compare it to civs with a greater geographic expanse that are currently in the game. Now, we could be fair to the sort of Norman-ruled Kingdom of Sicily, which did extend into southern Italy and northern Africa for a time. But regardless of how you slice it, this regime, if you will, this dynasty, did go toe-to-toe with the Byzantines in this area for well over a century. So the Sicilians did have a major impact on the region. And it's just tough to point that out with the Three Kingdom civs. It just feels a little too insular. Now, I don't think that's a major issue, because I do think part of the point of Age of Empires 2 is to imagine how civilizations that never encountered one another would have fought, right? This is the sort of, can a samurai beat a knight? Can a Viking beat a jaguar warrior? Kind of, hypothetical arguments we all tend to have. So again, I think the fact that even with this sort of insularity around these Three Kingdom civs, I still don't find it to be a compelling logic for why they shouldn't be in the game. And in fact, let me also put this here on the line, my last point about history. I think it's probably the case that most people didn't really have much of an idea what these three kingdoms even were. But guess what? I don't think I'd ever heard of the Cumans before Age of Empires 2 DE. I wasn't an expert on the Burgundians or the Gujaras before their various expansions either. But what did I do? It actually gave me an opportunity to learn a lot more about them. And I think that's one of the awesome things that Age of Empires 2 does, and especially for those of us who grew up with the game, I think Age of Empires 2 inspired a lot of us to learn a lot more about a history we might not have been familiar with. And so for me, when it comes to the historical timeline, because I buy the developers' argument, at least in terms of they could hack it in the medieval era when it comes to their, say, maturity as states, I view this more as an opportunity to learn more about a space and time that I'm not familiar with. Now, the second reason that I see as to why people think that the 3K civs shouldn't be in the game is that some people like to think that Age of Empire 2 civilizations, they are distinct cultures. Once again, this is a criticism that it's really hard for me to get hopped up on. And there's a number of reasons why. Basically, I just don't buy the fact that civilizations in Age of Empires 2 are distinct cultures. I mean, first things first, at the end of the day, the game is called Age of Empires. It's not called Age of Peoples, it's not called Age of Cultures, whatever you want to do, right? Whether you name a civ based on more of like an ethnic basis or perhaps more of a political one, the big question for me is whether or not there was some group at some geographic point in space and time that mustered a significant enough amount of military power, whether you want to call it an empire or not, that at least it could behave enough like one to merit inclusion. Second thing that I'll really get into with this is that Age of Empires 2 plays really fast and loose with what civilizations represent. I mean, Age of Empires 2 is a game where you translate resource production into military power. While medieval militaries, armies and navies, these are organisms managed by political units like dynasties or an aristocracy. So when we think about what civilizations represent culturally, it's not only inclusive of just political aspects, but it might even be easier to represent some civilizations perhaps via that political reference, if that's really where the management of the army is coming from. I mean, look, if you really think Age of Empires 2 civilizations are distinct cultures, you should be really upset about the names of basically all of our expansions. They're the dynasties of India, the lords of the West, the mountain royals, Dawn of the Dukes, the last Khans. I mean, you can forgive a casual observer here if you think that the civilizations in the game actually might, be in some part these sort of political units. I mean, again, the Sicilians, right? I mentioned them earlier. You could probably get away with renaming them the Normans, but you know what? The Kingdom of Sicily is probably a little too diverse in terms of cultures, and well, you also had Norman rule in the British Isles for a while, so it's just easier to describe the Sicilians, right, according more to the sort of geographic area that the Normans and their successors ruled over. I think the Byzantines as well, right? Byzantines, historically at least, tend to identify as Romans, right? And again, it's such a vast region. I think the identity of the Civ, right? It's just a lot easier to call them the Byzantines to capture this, the diversity that was in the Byzantine Empire at the time. I think the Teutons are an example where we go in the opposite direction. Again, this is one of the most confusingly named civs in the game. And most people associate the term Teutons with Germanic tribes from antiquity. Now, later on, of course, there was also a Teutonic order, a Catholic order of knights in what was essentially medieval Germany. And the Teutons in the game, I think, are kind of a composite between that and the Holy Roman Empire. I mean, we're talking about political institutions here for the most part, but it's really the case, for the Teutons. I think it's just easier to name them more succinctly with perhaps more of an ethnic cultural label than a political one. Even if, honestly, it's an ethnic label that I don't know how much sense it really makes, but, it's probably the best you can do. Again, I think we could dance this dance all night when it comes to what AoE 2 civs represent. I just think the game's already too loose with it. And to me, I see this really in terms of space, time, and military power. Give me a geographic locale, give me a time period. Can I find some people in history, making a difference militarily out there? Those to me are the necessary conditions. And since it's a game overall, I'm content to be, to be fairly loose when it comes to anything after that. Now, the third thing I've seen thrown around quite a bit is that many people are saying that the 3K civs would be better off in the Chronicles expansion. Or I don't even know if it's technically referred to as an expansion. Maybe it's a side story. I don't really get into it. I think there's a lot of movement out there that seems pretty desperate to consign these 3 civs to the Chronicles. And it's funny to me, actually, that, people can be so hyped for Chronicles as a side story, and then yet, take a stand in terms of the thematic integrity of Age of Empires 2. I think, if anything, Chronicles has done more to muddy the waters of what belongs in the game Age of Empires 2 than pretty much anything else. I mean, it really feels more like an attempt to overwrite Age of Empires 1. Again, I don't really care about that. I'm fine with side stories, but, that's me. If you want to be really Puritan about what civilizations belong in the game, I just think it's inconsistent to support one and not the other. And quite frankly, I would also disagree that the civs are better off in Chronicles. Yes, there are unique techs, unique units that feel a bit off. I do find it hard to make the case that we should have hero units in the game, being played on the rank ladder and shit like that. But look, it's pretty easy for the developers to disable hero units and balance new techs and new units. The Chronicle civs, the Athenians, the Spartans, the Achaemenids, right, whatever the other one is, they have technology trees that are much more different than the Age of Empire 2 civs. There's not nearly as much overlap. The 3K civs, while they do have, again, some OP units you could shorten the names of, I mentioned heroes, etc. Overall, the tech trees of the 3K civs are much more similar to those that are in the, let's just call it competitive Age of Empires 2, non-Chronicles Age of Empires 2, canonical Age of Empires 2. I have no idea what to even call the game anymore. By the way, I think that's a problem. And I think, speaking of problems, I think it would take a lot more effort to make the 3K civs fit into the Chronicles DLC, because there are already those differences, right? The tech trees are similar enough to Age of Empires 2. Modify the tech trees, but I think we could get there and it's going to be all right. And what I really see, and this is kind of the last point I'll make on criticisms, but it's not so much a criticism of the DLC and the civs as maybe it's kind of like an overarching criticism, is that there's been so much hype around the possibility of an East Asian DLC for years. And I think this is a lot of what has made the reaction to this DLC so visceral. And to me, it really comes down to managing expectations. When, again, you have this DLC that's been really anticipated, people have dreamed about for a long time, and then you add to the fact that we're going to have 5 new civilizations, things just get turbocharged. Additionally, by branding this as the sort of, it really is kind of like Romance of the Three Kingdoms into Age of Empires 2, it puts these 3 civilizations from Chinese antiquity in the spotlight. I mean, heck, I haven't really even mentioned it in this video, so you could be forgiven if you'd forgotten that the Jurchens and the Khitans are also going to be in this DLC. And those are 2 civs that people have been hoping to see in the game for a while, and honestly, they look pretty fun to play with. People are excited about it. I think if you'd taken the DLC, right, and if you'd only had the Jurchens and the Khitans, and made it like Dynasties of the East or something along those lines, people would have really been into it. You would have, basically been sort of taking the sort of, the ethnic forebears of the Lao and the Jin dynasties, right? And boom, you'd have something there for you. And even if, I think in a DLC like that, you had these 3 kingdoms, right? Just not making them the spotlight and the focus, I think this would have actually gone over a lot more smoothly. Everybody's going to find fault in things, but again, I think it's what you choose to make the spotlight. I think it matters. And I think it's the case, right? That folks had pretty high expectations. Perhaps that's something that should have been anticipated. I think it's always going to be the case, right? That because of this extant hype, an East Asian DLC would need to hit different. And perhaps, right, if some of the messaging around this would have been handled differently, I don't know. I think maybe we'd be in a different situation in terms of the reaction to the game. So ultimately, at the end of the day, I'm not going to be the one that hyperventilates about these new civilizations, at least not in terms of gameplay just yet, right? I can agree they're a bit of a strange choice. Maybe the thing that would have been better to do is tell a story about them, it maybe seems like more of a campaign, I can buy those arguments. And honestly, if the developers decided just to ditch them for whatever reason, I wouldn't care. But I doubt they will, because hey, the title of the DLC is Three Kingdoms. So given all of that, what I'd really like to see is, I'd like to see the developers renege on the promise to put them on the ranked ladder because they're so unusual. Let us test them out in unranked, balance them, and if you want to put them on the ladder after that, then sure. And in the meantime, your boy here is probably going to take this opportunity, kind of being introduced to the Shu, the Wei, and the Wu, and maybe I'm going to go read Romance of the Three Kingdoms and, brush up on some of my Chinese history and do what Age of Empires do is what it's always done for me. It's helped me have fun learning about new civilizations and world history. With that being said, guys, when I'm not reading, you might find me out there on the ladder, and hey, perhaps I'll see you out there. Peace.